But what makes her significant is she's the first hymn writer, male or female, to really write laments. So Isaac Watts doesn't write laments. He only did 133 of the 150 Psalms. And in his preface, he says that there are some Psalms, which, I hope this won't offend, but he literally says that they're too Jewish and he couldn't get Christian joy into them.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Hymnpartial, the podcast where we talk all things church music. I'm Anne Funke.
And I'm Cara Devereaux. And in today's episode, we have an exciting guest with us, Kevin Twit, the founder of Indelible Grace. We'll be talking about the Baptist hymn writer Anne Steele, why we should be reading old books, and how what we sing shapes what we believe. All that and more.
But first, if you haven't already, head on over to hymnpartial.com and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. This allows us to keep in touch with you when the pesky algorithms of social media decide to up and change. Plus, the weekly newsletter contains all sorts of fun bonus content, including exclusive videos that our subscribers get to see first. In this week's bonus clip, we will be talking to Kevin Twit about his extensive hymn book collection and which of the many books he reaches for the most. But if you're listening to this and you haven't signed up yet, you will have to wait to gain that content. So don't miss out next time. Go over to hymnpartial.com and sign up for our free weekly newsletter today.
So we really enjoyed talking to Kevin Twit of Indelible Grace. We've wanted to have him on the show for quite a while, so we were delighted that he can make time for that. We had a great chat, and I particularly enjoyed hearing about Anne Steele. She wasn't someone that I was particularly familiar with, and I got quite excited because it turns out that she lived about half an hour from where I was born, so it was kind of a nice connection.
Yeah, I thought it was really fun. He knows tons and tons about hymns and hymn history. I was particularly encouraged by just kind of hearing the origins of Indelible Grace and how it really revealed his pastoral heart. And it's just interesting when you hear about these collectives because you don't really know why or how they get started. And to hear that it was basically a pastor answering the needs of the people under him. And that's how this got started. It was really, really encouraging. So loads of fun stuff we talked about. I think you guys will really enjoy it. So without further ado, here's the interview. Kevin Twit is a graduate of Berklee College of Music and Covenant Theological Seminary. He worked in the music industry for several years as a guitarist and recording engineer and has been the RUF campus minister at Belmont University since 1995. In 1999, Kevin began Indelible Grace Music with some of his Belmont students and has made 9 CDs and a documentary film. Kevin has taught hymnology at Belmont, Covenant Seminary, and RTS Atlanta. Kevin Twit, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Exciting.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you on. We follow you on Instagram and we love when you talk about all your hymns and stuff. We also really like the work of Indelible Grace. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and about the founding of Indelible Grace?
Yeah. I guess the short version is, I came here in Nashville, worked in the music industry, eventually, felt the call to ministry. So I went to Covenant Seminary, came back in 95 to Nashville and started RUF at Belmont. RUF is the campus ministry of the PCA, Conservative Presbyterian Denomination. And at Belmont, a lot of the students come from church backgrounds. And I would have this regular conversation with students from church backgrounds who wondered if they really were Christians. And as I would press into what was driving some of that, I discovered that a lot of them felt like if they didn't feel like they were on the mountaintop all the time, that maybe they weren't true Christians. And as I was like, where is that coming from? Because it's certainly not in the Psalms. It certainly doesn't seem to be the biblical view of spirituality or the best of the Reformed tradition. It dawned on me that some of the problem was the songs that they were singing were lying to them about what the normal Christian life felt like. Wow. Songs that were like, Lord, I just love you all the time. It's all I ever want to do. Just rang pretty hollow. And so I was like, gosh, we got to find some better songs to sing. This movement had started in RUF a little bit. There was some kind of fledgling attempts by the time I got back from seminary, and with my background as a recording engineer, and I had all these amazing students, people like Sandra McCracken and Matthew Smith and Katie Bowser, just all these folks were all in Nashville. Belmont is maybe half music students, and so many talented ones that eventually I was like, maybe we should make a recording after, I guess I would say at about 5 years, we were taking some of these old hymn texts. I would find old hymns in books. I have, as you can see, lots of old books. I never thought I'd get to go to seminary. So I thought I was going to just be kind of self-taught. And I just found these old books were really helpful. I don't know if you ever read C.S. Lewis's essay on the reading of old books, where he suggests reading 2 old books for every 1 new book. And that was the essay I read in college, and have found that to be really good advice ever since. And so I just started finding some of these old hymns. We'll talk later about Anne Steele, but for instance, finding a text like "Be a Refuge in My Weary Soul," and being like, whoa, like that just is so different than the kinds of songs my students are singing. And we really need to find a way to sing things like that. But hymnals before the middle of the 19th century, they don't have music in them. Right. They're just the texts. And so I was like, how are we going to sing that? I guess I'll come up with a tune. Or sometimes I would just Xerox off the words and hand it out to my students. Hey, we're going to sing this to the traditional tune of Come Thou Fount. But if somebody wants to write a tune this week, we'll do it again. We'll try it out next week. So one of the good things about doing college ministry is you don't have people complaining when you mess with the hymns. I think if I'd been a music director at a church, it wouldn't have ever happened. Right. But the college students were up for trying new things and kind of grabbed hold of the idea. And after about 5 years, we had a whole group of songs. And I had this background as a recording engineer, and a buddy gave me the keys to his studio he wasn't using. And we made that first record, put 17 songs on it because we didn't think we'd get to make another one. And the response just kind of blew us away. And so that's kind of sort of became a big part of my life's work ever since.
Wow. That is so interesting that that the heart of this kind of collective came out of your kind of pastoral heart for the students that you were seeing in their struggle with their assurance and their salvation. That is wonderful.
Yeah, that very much. I definitely want to emphasize that it really was about trying to help students get a better, more honest understanding of Christian life. I tell people we needed songs that were more honest about struggle and more explicit about the gospel, because those were missing from so many of the songs that we were singing.
It's so interesting as well, the impact that songs specifically have, because a lot of the emphasis, particularly in Reformed circles, can be on preaching, which is wonderful. Good preaching is good. But I think sometimes we forget as well the impact that songs can have on us.
Yes.
Absolutely. I like to make the point, so many of the preaching heroes that people think about in the Reformed tradition, particularly if you get like the Banner of Truth kind of version, all you think they did was preach. Right? Most people don't know that George Whitefield put out a hymn book. They don't know that Spurgeon put a hymn book out. J.C. Ryle put out a hymn book. Who's that? John Newton, of
John
course.
Newton as well,
Yeah, but even, other folks like J. Alexander, the first president of Princeton Seminary, over and over and over again. And, Luther and Calvin, like curating songs for the church were things they worked on their entire career. But we definitely have seen a kind of a split between the pastor and the song leader in a lot of our churches. And I don't think that's been a very helpful development. But you're right.
Yes.
I think,
I'm so grateful to hear you say that. I mean, we had a pastor, an English pastor on a few months ago called Jeremy Walker, and we were speaking with him about Spurgeon and his use of hymns during his preaching. And one of the things that came up was just, I guess, our desire to see pastor, hymn writer normalized again in our, current day. And I guess I want to see it normalized, but then I also am surprised that more and more pastors that we meet actually have written hymns. Maybe they're not as prolific as some of the guys that we just mentioned, but they do. They'll be sitting there poring over the text for their their congregation throughout the week, and they're like, you know what? I can't find a hymn that speaks to this thing. And so they'll write a hymn. And that's much more old school. That's much more John Newton-y, he's
John Newton did that very specifically, didn't he?
Yeah.
I think also, though, you got to remember, in those days, everybody studied poetry and wrote poetry.
Yes.
They also were drawing from the King James Bible, which we have to admit is a much poetically richer translation than a lot of what we have. So I think part of it is we've lost that. But you're right. There definitely have been some famous preachers that are hymn writers. I think of D.A. Carson. I think of James Montgomery Boyce. I think of R.C. Sproul. So there definitely are some of those, and we could use more for sure.
Yes. Amen. Well,
I have no gift. I tell people I co-write with dead people. I don't really have, I don't think, a gift for lyric writing. So I never thought I could be a songwriter. And then I just, out of necessity, started writing tunes. I guess because I'm not a very good singer, then maybe the tunes I write can be sung by normal people. So that's ended up being helpful,
Well, we're very grateful for the work that you've done over the years, and particularly with Indelible Grace. Our church really benefits greatly from the new hymn tunes.
Oh, that's awesome.
That you have produced.
I really want to come to England and shop for books one of these days.
Come to Edinburgh. Here. We have some fantastic second-hand bookshops.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. I get it. Is it Nichols? James Nichols? No,
yes. Also, armchair books.
Okay. Yeah. I get the email catalog from one of them. I've been buying from them for years and years. Yeah.
Well, we saw on your Instagram that you're a big fan of Anne Steele, which you did mention a bit ago. Yep. Can you tell us a little bit about who she is for most of our listeners who don't know who she is, and a little bit about her life's works?
Yes. She's really the first significant female hymn writer, English Baptist woman, particular Baptist. So maybe some of your listeners will know that's like the Calvinistic Baptist stream. She lived in the 1700s. And she lived about 20 miles from Isaac Watts, actually. But my English geography isn't very good. But is it Broughton? Is that how you say it?
Broughton. Broughton. It's about 35 minutes from where I was born. Oh, yeah. Okay.
She was actually from a pretty well-to-do family. Her dad was a timber merchant, but he also was the pastor of the Baptist church. Some people say, he wasn't able to be paid. That's because he didn't need to be paid. So he would buy forests and then sell them to the British Navy. So I suspect that some of the ships that fought against the Americans in the Revolution, were came from his timber. But anyway, but she's a fascinating woman. She, was very sickly. There's a number of apocryphal stories about her. There's a story about her fiance drowning on the day before she was to be married. That's not true. So there you find, probably you guys have been doing hymn research now, so you find that there's definitely some apocryphal stories out there.
Yeah.
But what makes her significant is she's the first hymn writer, male or female, to really write laments. So Isaac Watts doesn't write laments. He only did 133 of the 150 Psalms. And in his preface, he says that there are some Psalms, which, I hope this won't offend, but he literally says that they're too Jewish and he couldn't get Christian joy into them. So he doesn't know what to do with Psalms like Psalm 88, which ends, "Darkness is my closest friend," in the NIV translation. Anne Steele does about 35 or so Psalm versions, and she does Psalm 88. Yeah. Charles Wesley, likewise, didn't do laments. Probably had something to do with the Christian perfectionism. And so what's interesting is her hymns cross denominational lines quicker than Watts or Wesley, because I think they resonated particularly with English people who were used to singing psalms. She reflects the full range of emotions that you find in the Psalms. And I just found, she was incredibly popular up until around the 20th century. And I found that hymn, "Dear Refuge of My Weary Soul," in an old hymn book by John Rippon. Maybe you know Rippon's collection. He's a predecessor to Spurgeon, actually. Okay. So I had maybe an 1806 edition of Rippon's hymns, and saw this, "Dear Refuge of My Weary Soul," and I was arrested by that first line. You could say that in church? And this is an hymnal. people in charge like authorized singing songs like that. And I can't imagine singing songs like that today. It just said Steele. I didn't know who Steele was. I had to do some research and eventually discovered Anne Steele. And I think what's cool is there's a great book called To Express the Ineffable by a lady named Cynthia Alders with 2 A's. She has been up at Regent in Vancouver, Canada, but she's working on her PhD, I think, and at least is over in England at times, working on Anne Steele. It's a cool story. Like there's a guy who was her professor, Bruce Hindmarsh, wrote a great book on John Newton. He came and did a conference for us, like an Indelible Grace hymn conference in 2002. And we played Dear Refuge for him. He didn't know about Anne Steele either, and took that back to his students. Cynthia was in his class and really got enamored with Anne Steele, and then did her master's on Anne Steele and wrote this book that taught me so much more about Anne Steele than I ever could have discovered on my own. So, so there's been, I guess, a renaissance of sorts with her writings. And I'll mention to you, you can get this on Amazon. A buddy of mine did a new collection of all of her poems and hymns and psalms called Refuge of My Weary Soul. And I wrote a little preface to it. So you can get it in hardback now too, I think. Yeah. So I've been looking for her books. Her books, I'm afraid, unless you buy that one I just showed you, are quite expensive. When I was first looking for her, I was able to find this 1808 2-volume edition for about $60. This is about $1,000 now. Because there's just not very many of them out there. And I found over the quarantine, I found this actually, which is volume 2. It's the first edition of Anne Steele. And you'll see she published under a pen name, Theodosia. Because it was a little bold to put words in the mouth of men, worshipers, in 1769, which is when she published that. And so she published under the pen name. But anyway, she's fabulous, and I commend her work to everybody. Maybe we'll read one of hers a little later.
Wow, that's incredible.
Oh, I'll say one thing. She really comes across like a Jane Austen kind of character. Like she had numerous opportunities to be married, and most of them from pastors, and she turned them down. She wanted to focus on her work, on her poetry. She felt really called to do that. She had the financial means that she didn't need to be married, and her dad was a pastor, so she knew what a pastor's wife, what that role was like. And so there's actually in one of the biographies of her, there's this incredible marriage proposal. It literally sounds like something out of a Jane Austen book that she turned down. It's amazing. You got to track it down. It's by another hymn writer too, a guy named Benjamin Bedham. So it seemed like it would have been like a soulmate, but yeah. Anyway, you'll have to look. I'll email it to you because it's incredible.
With someone who we would get along with, maybe.
Oh yeah. And there actually is a lady that has written a book just about Anne Steele and her social circle, because they would write letters to one another, and they would write these like poems that were like games to one another. It was a very sophisticated. She actually got her mother-in-law got a lot of flack, her stepmother, for sending her and her sister to a boarding school in a day when you really weren't supposed to educate women, especially if you were in a particular Baptist circle. So there's lots of interesting things about her.
Yeah.
So
she sounds
incredible.
Like a fascinating woman that I would love to meet.
Yes, I know. There's no picture of her, but the family still owns the house. So there are pictures of the house. And there are papers of hers that have never been published. I think they're in Bristol, maybe. Can't remember. But anyway.
Ooh. That's so cool. Now I want to see if her house is open for visitors.
I know. Yeah. Go take a tour or something. I know. I'd love to come to England and do like a hymn history tour, one day. That's a dream.
I visited Olney in the summer, and that was really cool.
Oh, did you? Yes. I follow them, on Instagram, and I've interacted with them. I actually have a William Cooper signed document that I tracked down.
That's amazing.
Yeah. We're big Cooper fans.
Yeah, I named our oldest son as Cooper. We named him Cooper, but we spelled it Cooper because we didn't want people saying Cowper Twit.
Cowper. Yeah.
Cowper Twit, that's just too much, right?
So Anne Steele sounds like an incredible woman.
Mm-hmm.
But she did live a long time ago. So why does she matter to us today?
Yeah, well, if I could, steal some of what C.S. Lewis says in that essay on the reading of old books, it's one of the ways to get past your cultural blinders and your assumptions is to interact with people who lived hundreds of years ago or from other cultures. Mostly because our assumptions about life are hard to kind of get to the surface and examine. In particular, when you think about suffering, I would say most modern Christians think that suffering is something to get through as quick as possible, rather than asking, how can I meet and commune with God in the midst of suffering? And I don't think you'll actually ask the question about what to do with suffering, or you won't even frame it if you don't interact with somebody like Anne Steele and you're like, whoa, she thinks about her suffering very differently than I do. Now, she might be wrong, but I'll never ask the question if I don't have, her or somebody else who's like a voice that can be a sort of foil to say, look at your assumptions and maybe you've missed something here. So I think that's one of the real reasons. But I think she's also an inspiration. She's the first hymn writer to really, write laments, publish them herself, which is pretty interesting. Her first two hymns, which she arranged the order of the hymns herself this way, are both about the inadequacy of human language to express praise to God. And yet she cries out for God to help her. So I think actually there's a lot of lessons even for modern hymn writers on that posture. I could go on and on and on, but I really think, I think that question will disappear if you start reading her work for yourself. Yeah. That's my contention.
Okay. Well, then we recommend you guys, listeners, go out and read her work.
Yeah, absolutely. Is this a good time to read it now, I guess?
Yeah, just, well, I think you hit on something, obviously, with that C.S. Lewis quote, but also in terms of getting different perspectives, because I know, and I've mentioned on the show before, that the world of hymns was kind of cracked open for me when I moved to Scotland from the States. And this has never, ever been shade towards my old church. My old church back in California even has started to incorporate more and more older hymns into their service. But I needed that perspective change because Scotland, having a much older history than our country and having a different relationship to hymns and psalms, and even instruments, there's many churches in Scotland that don't have any, and so
all that,
getting that perspective actually did show me something richer in how we approach sung worship, in the West in general. And obviously looking back even further to someone like Anne Steele, you'll start to appreciate even just the language. I think that's the most fascinating thing about these old hymns is the language that is out of date and kind of ancient to us, and looking up what that means and then seeing how they brought that to the Lord in worship. You go, whoa. And that perspective change is so priceless. Like you can't put a value on it.
I think one of the things I like to remind people is the church is bigger than people that talk like us.
Yeah.
And when you sing these old hymns, that's a good reminder of that. That's one of the reasons I don't usually change the these and thous unless they're just so awkward that or there's a word that people can't understand. I'd rather explain the word and hold on to it rather than like get rid of Ebenezer and come out. I'd rather explain it. Yeah. So the other thing I would say that maybe I feel like we've really lost, but it's where I usually start with why hymns is worship is formative, whether we like it or not. And a lot of people today think of it as expressive, as emotive, but they don't take note of the way it's shaping and forming us. And I think once you realize that that's happening, it does change the way you attend to the songs.
Yes.
because they really are modeling what the normal Christian life feels like, both for people that are in your church and even people who aren't Christians who are trying to figure out what Christianity is. I'm afraid that some people outside of the Christian world would, I do think, feel sometimes like faith is just sort of an ability to keep your head up when, when storms arise. It's kind of a temperament that religious people have that not everybody has. And I think that's tragic, because that's not at all a good representation of what Christianity is. And I think the songs that we sing sometimes can be a barrier towards people understanding the gospel and what it does.
Yeah, definitely. So I think you've already hit on this, but what is your favorite Anne Steele hymn?
Dear refuge of my weary soul. And I just love it. I mean, even that first line, a lot of times when I'm looking through old hymnals for texts that I might want to retune, that first line has to grab you. And then you kind of keep reading and it continues to have insight, say things maybe in a fresh way, or fill in a gap in the songs that we have that maybe we don't have enough on a certain topic. So Dear Refuge, for a long time has been that one for me.
It's an excellent song. It's I love the versions that you guys have recorded out there, and I think we've sung them at least once or twice.
Have you? I find it's not the easiest one to sing congregationally.
Really?
I think so.
Oh, well, we
it's got
tried
a
it.
4 bar in it, so the timing can be a little wonky. But I feel like people are singing it more and more these days.
Yeah, we even used we used the tune that you guys for a psalm in our Scottish Psalter that we used. So we were like, actually, this has the same meter. And we used that tune for that psalm. And I thought it worked well.
That's really
so
cool.
It's like, it's great because we've loved recently having so many hymn writers and composers on the show, because we really do kind of talk about the hymn text. And like you said, older hymnals just really only had the text.
Yeah.
And there's a lot there, but a tune is so important to a hymn because it could make or break it, it could make or break it in terms of not its strength in the text, but in terms of how many generations will actually sing that hymn. Yeah,
for sure. Though I think I heard a guy, Paul Westermeyer, who's a Lutheran hymn scholar. He gave a talk once on hymn tunes that last more than a generation or two. And he said one of the things that you find is most of the ones that last multiple generations are based in folk music. They tend to transcend cultures and generations better.
That makes me proud.
Yeah. Well, hymn tune, Hughes Oliphant Old said that hymns should be a kind of folk music. And actually, the standard kind of English ballad meter that comes from Anselm's meter, which was a popular Latin meter. He could have written his hymns in classical Latin meters. He didn't. He wrote it in a popular meter, which has come down to be the English ballad meter, which is, what a lot of hymn tunes are based on.
Yeah.
So there's a long connection there.
Yeah.
So would you mind just reading us that Anne Steele hymn?
No, I'd love to.
Because we've talked about it a little. So just for our readers who aren't familiar.
Yeah, absolutely. I will. And I'm going to read it out of this book because there's a verse that we left out of our recorded version. And when I discovered it later, I couldn't put it in there because, my tune, it has like an A and a B section, and it's almost like answers, right? And I got the hymn text out of John Rippon's collection. He actually left out verse 2. So if you reinsert verse 2, it mixes up the A and B. But since I'm just reading it, I'm going to read the whole thing. All right. So her original title is God, the Only Refuge of the Troubled Mind. She actually wrote she wrote hymns about night terrors and all kinds of things. Anyway, dear refuge of my weary soul, on thee when sorrows rise, on thee when waves of trouble roll, my fainting hope relies. I've always been struck by fainting hope rely. That's a bold word. Doesn't seem like an expression of faith, does it? It's very much like Psalm 73, though. You know, surely God is good to Israel, but let me tell you how my feet had almost slipped. And that's what you're going to see what she does here. So she confesses, you know, that he's the only refuge. And then she says, while hope revives, though pressed with fears, and I can say, my God, beneath thy feet I spread my cares and pour my woes abroad. So she's basically saying, I'm having a moment of clarity and assurance. My sense of assurance is strong. So I'm going to lay out before you kind of what's going on. I love it. I love this hymn so much. To thee I tell each rising grief, for thou alone canst heal. Thy word can bring a sweet relief for every pain I feel. But oh, then exclamation point, which is her punctuation, right? She has exclamation points all over the place in her hymns. There's a very kind of robust strength and energy. She says, but oh, when gloomy doubts prevail, again, a strong word, prevail, not just nip around my heels, but through Jesus, I rise above it. No, she says, when gloomy doubts prevail, I fear to call thee mine. The springs of comfort seem to fail, and all my hopes decline. Yet, gracious God, where shall I flee? Thou art my only trust, and still my soul would cleave to thee, though prostrate in the dust. Hast thou not bid me seek thy face, and shall I seek in vain? And can the ear of sovereign grace be deaf when I complain? No, still the ear of sovereign grace attends the mourner's prayer. Oh, may I ever find access to breathe my sorrows there. I love that, breathe my sorrows. Sometimes that's all you can do, right?
Yeah.
Thy mercy seat is open still. Here let my soul retreat. With humble hope attend thy will and wait beneath thy feet. So she comes back to a place of trust, but it's a sobered, it's not triumphalistic. And anyway, yeah, I love that one. But I tell you, there's so many good ones in her work.
I love that you can hear the Psalms in what she's saying. You can hear like these echoes of the lament, but the hope as well and the faith. I really, really like that. Yeah.
You would love her version of Psalm 88 because she has the courage to be honest. It doesn't end happy. You know, most other people who've done versions of Psalm 88, at least until recently, tend to make it happy at the end.
Yeah, they tend to add bits to make it less.
Yeah, but sometimes the sorrow is still going on when the song's over, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We were actually talking about Cooper recently and his hymn, God Moves in a Mysterious Way, and just saying like it's the fact that he faces up to the reality of suffering that makes his hymns really have impact. There
is a story, it's probably apocryphal, but man, that was the hymn he wrote as he felt the depression coming on him again.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've never asked the museum what they think about that. You know,
there's argument that it doesn't work with the dating of when it was.
Got it. Yep.
When it was published,
it sounds too good to be true. So I felt like it seemed like an apocryphal story.
Yeah, but I mean, he was always on the brink of insanity. That guy. So
So it still speaks to what he was in ahead. The signed document I have from him is from when he was a law clerk. Which is why it was a little more affordable because it's not just his signature, it has a couple other people, but it also that's when he had his psychic break, right? When he was studying for the bar. So it's from that, which then led to his conversion. So it's kind of especially precious to me, you know?
Yeah.
Just to pick up on what we've been speaking about in terms of how honest Anne was in terms of these kind of deep sorrows, this lament. We actually just finished a series on the Providence of God. And what we were reflecting on afterwards is that so many of the songs that we picked, maybe every single one, now that I'm thinking about it, actually speaks about God's providence in the midst of deep sorrow and trials and being caught in the storm. Like almost every single hymn writer, and they were all different, spoke. And I thought, I didn't expect that when we were approaching it. I thought we would maybe have more, not happy clappy necessary, but but more like joyful songs, even though they did have quite a bit of joy in them. But it was interesting to see that the hymn writer reflects on God's providing in the middle of not being, provided for in the way that we would think of it in worldly terms or in secular terms.
Yeah.
So I do find that those hymns could be very encouraging because, as you say, that's real life.
Yeah. Well,
That's real life.
if your church isn't singing songs like that, then when you're experiencing that, you feel crazy and you feel like you can't tell anybody else what's really going on.
Yeah.
So I think there's so many. I mean, we could talk for hours about how important it is. Yeah.
I mean,
Cooper's hymn, Sometimes a Light Surprises.
I love that song.
Yeah. And I love that he used the word sometimes.
Yeah.
Yes.
A clear, season or cheering season after rain, but it's not always, it's sometimes, but it's still, what the Puritans called God's kisses, that kind of assurance, full assurance, some have said, like, that's a reality. We don't despise that. But we don't trust in that. Rather, we trust in Jesus, like that old hymn on Christ the solid rock. I dare not trust the sweetest frame. And most people don't know what a frame is. It's kind of an emotional state, a frame of mind, so to speak. We don't trust in the sweet frame. We don't despise them either. But we have to speak truthfully about that. And I love that so many of these hymn writers also were letter writers, like John Newton. And so sometimes you can read, his letters and then get insight into his pastoral approach that you see in the hymns as well.
So true. So, having talked about the value of old hymns, if I was a brand new Christian or a Christian who's brand new to hymns and I'd never heard of or sung a hymn in my life, what would you suggest that I start with?
Well, I suspect that they've probably already heard Amazing Grace. And if they're in the UK, they've probably heard Abide With Me. So what else? I mean, Dear Refuge with My Weary Soul is a good one. Let Us Love and Sing and Wonder by John Newton, I think is one of the greatest. Those would probably be two of my favorites. But I think I would probably try to tell them the story behind the hymn too, because as you all come to understand, that really enriches people's experience and use of these hymns. I like to tell people it's good to talk about why we're doing what we're doing.
Yes.
When we made that first Indelible Grace record, I've included a page or a couple paragraphs about why we were doing what we're doing, because I really wanted people to grab hold of the vision and not just receive it as a consumer and say, I like this or I don't like that.
Yes.
And I think that's what's helped other people be able to pick up the baton and say, hey, that's a vision we believe in, and we want to add our voice to this. Since we put out that first Indelible Grace record in 2000, my first friend Bruce Benedict, I don't know if you know Bruce, the hymnary, he's up at Hope College, and Cardiphonia is his website. He does a lot of cool hymn stuff and gets a lot of indie musicians to be involved. Anyway, he was working on a PhD on the history of the retuned hymn movement, and even 10 years ago had documented maybe 1,000 new hymn tunes since that first Indelible Grace record. So that's been really cool to me to see how many people have kind of picked up the baton and taken it and incarnated this idea in different musical styles. Because I don't think it always has to be a folk music style. We've tried to press in, with Heal Us on our last record, which is a Cooper, right? We tried to put that in a gospel music voice, right? It just seemed to be the right tone, the right feel, and so trying to even demonstrate for people there's the idea is what's important, kind of finding your heart music language and being able to recover these hymns, maybe a way of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater,
yes
and how exciting it is that a lot of my students and former students are going around in used bookstores looking for old hymnals. And I know that that's happening because I used to be able to buy cool leather-bound hymnals on eBay for $20, and now they're $75. So, I used to always, that's the present I like to give when I do someone's wedding My students, I like
That's
to give them a
lovely.
hymnal, but they're too expensive now. I can't do it as easy.
Yes.
So, oh well.
Oh, well, honestly, we could, and we probably would if we weren't limited by time, talk to you all the live long day
Yeah.
about
do it
this
again
stuff
sometime.
because, yes, we will definitely hold you to that.
Yeah.
But we'll have you stick around. We have a bonus question just for our subscribers to get first. But if you're not signed up to our newsletter, you won't be able to access it for quite some time. So, where can people find you? What's the best place for people to find you?
Oh, well, Instagram, Indelible Grace on Instagram. We have a Facebook page, but I don't think it's very helpful. If you go to gracemusic.com, you can join our email list. And I guess I would want to make sure people know about the Indelible Grace hymn book resource online. We have put a lot of work into that, making all this stuff available for people. We even have like Spanish translations of all the hymns. And anytime somebody says, can I write out a string part, for instance, I'm like, yes, great. Will you share it? And I'll post it there so that people can access it and download all that stuff for free as well.
Yes, it's a wonderful resource. Please go check it out. Kevin Twit, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it.